Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to call this meeting to order. And you might be wondering why the recording secretary is calling the meeting to order, and that is due to the absence of the chair and the vice chair today, who are unable to attend today's meeting. So I am Deputy Clerk and Recording Secretary Joel Watts, and with us today we have two alternate members attending, Councillor Ashmore and Councillor McDonald, along with committee members Pat O'Reilly, Mike Barkwell, Jason Willick, and Mayor Elmsley. And so the first order of business for today's meeting is to appoint an acting chair for today's meeting. And I will now call upon for nominations for the position of acting chair for the Planning Advisory Committee for today's proceedings only. A nomination, Mayor Elmsley.
I'll nominate Mr. O'Reilly as chair for this meeting.
Mr. O'Reilly, do you consent to the nomination?
It's only for 1 day.
If it's only for 1 day. All right. I call a second time for nominations for the position of acting chair, and a third time for the position of acting chair for today's meeting for the Planning Advisory Committee. Seeing no further nominations, I declare the nominations closed, and that Pat O'Reilly, you've been appointed acting chair, and you may retain a seat that might be familiar to you. So.
Well, I guess it's 1 o'clock, and we'll call this meeting to order. And could I get a motion to adopt today's agenda? Jason and Mike Barkwell, all those in favor? That's carried. Any declaration of pecuniary interest? None noted. If one does arise, just please let the chair know. I'll just read out the Planning Committee meeting from the public meeting. As required under the Planning Act, a public meeting is being held prior to the committee making recommendations on these applications. All the recommendations that come out of the afternoon will be forwarded to the next regular council meeting, which is, do we know what the date of that? August 20th, thanks, Joel. August 29th. The purpose of the public meeting is to allow the committee to gather information on the applications before us, to hear those wishing to make submissions on applications, and to allow the committee to ask questions of the applicants, interested parties, and staff. Everyone speaking today is requested to state their name to the public record, and in the interest of time, the committee respectfully asks that you keep your comments to no more than 5 minutes. Anyway, I think that's probably at this point. Please either unmute yourself and turn on the video, or Joel, you look after that, eh? All the rest. Okay, I guess we can go right into our first item today, which is Plan 2023-039, the committee, the City of Kawartha Lakes Zoning Bylaw Review Statutory Public Meeting, and we have Jonathan and Matthews. I guess both of them will be participating, and maybe you at some level, Richard, too?
Definitely could chime in.
Yes. Yeah, okay. So Jonathan, you're up.
Good afternoon, Planning Advisory Committee. I see I wore too plain of a shirt, perhaps.
You didn't get the memo?
Council chamber. I didn't get the memo on the fun shirt day, so I'll make sure to queue up for when we return with this one. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending, and thank you for having us. This is a big event, I'd like to say. WSP, Bobby, and Matt are here to present share with you the City of Kawartha Lakes rural zoning bylaw. So what I'm going to do is, as project lead for the municipality, what I'm going to do is run through the report very quickly, tell a brief story, kind of explain the narrative of how we got to where we are today. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt and Bobby to talk about and unpack a little bit the nuts and bolts of the project, highlight some key changes, run through the zones, and ultimately kind of present their deliverable to you, which is the rural zoning bylaw. So, as some of you may recall, work began on phase 1 of the rural zoning project back in 2019. So it's been a couple years in the making. Through phase 1, we had a handful of public open houses to discuss zoning issues, discuss content, discuss subject matter that would ultimately inform the report of the discussion and methodologies report, as well as the issues report. These documents built on those key issues that were gleaned from the first phase of the project. It highlighted certain topics that needed further exploration, including waterfront zoning and agricultural zoning. From that phase, phase 2 started, and both of those reports were issued in December 2020. The assessment of key issues and methodology report established steps to harmonizing the 14 existing rural area zoning bylaws. I will note that at that time it was 13, which I will touch on in a few minutes here. For steps to harmonize the 14 existing zoning bylaws and propose a new format and layout for the new document. A handful of key policy issues were also addressed, including, as I mentioned, waterfront areas, agricultural zoning, on-farm diversified uses, environmental protection, flooding, and hazard lands. In April 2021, the project team presented said report, and the meeting concluded with a question and answer period. There was also a bit of a project break in there as well due to the pandemic, due to staffing, resources, and whatnot, that the project took a brief hiatus, but we were happy to pick it up back in late January 2022 with the first draft of the document being released. A handful of public open houses were held in March. We had about 80 attendees across the board for those, which rolled nicely into phase 3. So in phase 3 of the project, we included Woodville as part of the rural zoning bylaw consolidation. So following an OLT settlement, Woodville was included in the project as it was formerly, or became rather, a hamlet in the rural area. So the 13 became 14, and we had a related public meeting it was geared or focused towards Woodville residents to introduce them to the project, bring them up to speed, and present potential recommendations and proposed zoning for the area. In March of this year, the second draft was released. We had, again, a number of consultation sessions with staff as well this time to discuss issues related to economic development, general planning concerns, policy, etc. So the purpose of today's meeting is to hold the statutory public meeting to introduce, propose the bylaw. What's going to happen is it has been recommended for referral back, as you will see, in order to collect any comments or concerns that are received between now and we set a date of September 1st. Due to the progress of the project, meeting statutory timelines, and just needing to have a finite sort of deadline for the project, we are looking to have a September 1st due date for comments, and we cannot exactly guarantee that anything received after that date would be incorporated into the final bylaw. So part of the engagement was with city staff and committees. So we consulted with the Agricultural Development Advisory Committee. We held a stakeholder workshop focused on waterfront areas and shoreline naturalization. Comments were received from the City of Kawartha Lakes Environmental Advisory Committee, from staff, from conservation authorities, and from other technical agencies. So the purpose of the rural zoning bylaw was to not only consolidate the 14 existing documents as sort of a housekeeping exercise, if you will, but to also ensure conformity with the official plan, as well as implement the policy direction of provincial policy documents. So with that, I presented sort of the high-level overview of the report, and I'm going to now hand it over to our consultants, WSP, Matt Rodriguez and Bobby Gauthier, to present the bylaw.
Okay, thank you very much, John.
I'm Matthew. Maybe just before you get started, I don't know whether, Joel, whether any of the committee members chimed in today or not. Are they watching today? I just want to recognize there was an awful lot of community input with a number of people on those committees that actually put a lot of time and energy into that as well. So I don't know whether they're watching today, but I just want to reach out and say thank you to them for all their time and effort they had put into this by the task force. Yeah. But none of them are chiming in as we know today. They might be watching on YouTube or something. Okay, thank you if you are watching. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of council, Mr. Mayor, members of staff, and the public. My name is Bobby Gauthier. I'm a project manager with WSP, and I'm the overall lead for the rural zoning bylaw review on the consulting team side. As John mentioned, I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Rodriguez, who is a senior planner with WSP. And Matt and I will be collaborating on today's presentation to walk you through some of the key aspects of the zoning bylaw. So as John mentioned right off the top, I'll echo his very positive sentiments. We're very excited to be here. I think that this is a very key milestone in a project that has been underway for about 4 years now. I know city staff are extremely excited to get a new zoning bylaw in place and to reap the rewards of a consolidated bylaw rather than having to administer 14 separate ones. So it's been a long time coming with a lot of work behind us, and I hope to walk through that today. So the presentation's about 20-25 minutes or so, and I'll start out with just a brief overview of some of the history and the background of the project. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Matt, who will give some of the highlights of the process, and then I'll close with some next steps. So in terms of why we're here today and the purpose of the overall project, I think John's kind of covered this already, but we're here for the statutory public meeting as required by the Planning Act when a municipality wants to complete a new zoning bylaw. We view this as being sort of the last formal opportunity for comment. As John noted, we've proposed a written comment deadline of September 1st, so we'd like to receive comments by then, and then the intent would be to finalize the bylaw and bring it forward for council adoption sometime in the fall. The purpose of the project, as John's mentioned, I think first and foremost, it's about consolidating the existing rural zoning bylaws. You know, the city's been administering 14 separate bylaws across the rural area, which of course leads to lots of issues, potential interpretation issues. When the city wants to make an update, they have to amend 14 bylaws rather than one. And then, of course, there's the frustration that we heard from residents that there are different rules that apply to different parts of the city, and that doesn't always make sense. So there's a lot of benefits to be gained out of this. A secondary, but also a legislated requirement of this process is that we conform to the official plan, and I'll talk about that on another slide. And then, of course, this is an opportunity to address other zoning issues that the community wishes us to engage with. Next slide, please, John. So John's kind of gone over the timeline quite well already, so I'll just summarize this briefly. As I said, this project's been going on for about 4 years. We started out, I think in the fall of 2019 with a discussion paper, as well as a series of open houses. And that was really about understanding what's the scope of this project. You know, what are we getting ourselves into in terms of consolidating these bylaws? And what changes do we need to make to the bylaws to ensure they meet the requirements of the official plan? That was what the discussion paper was about. We also produced an issues and methodology report that kind of built on that, fleshed out some options for key zoning issues, and also identified a very specific methodology for consolidating the bylaws. John mentioned there were some delays and pauses in the project due to COVID-19 and some staffing constraints on the city's end. But nonetheless, we were able to get a zoning bylaw released early 2022 as a first draft, and that built on the previously mentioned background work. The second draft bylaw came out about a year later, and now we're at the stage where we've got a final draft zoning bylaw in the summer of this year, and looking for adoption later this year. So there has been a few iterations of this very major document, as is normal in a zoning bylaw review. It's impossible to get the zoning bylaw perfectly right in one shot. We have to keep refining it based on input. The rural area, I keep mentioning this, so our zoning bylaw only addresses the rural area of the city of Kawartha Lakes. So it excludes the urban settlement areas, and it excludes the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan area. The intent is for the city to update the zoning within those areas as part of a subsequent phase of the zoning bylaw review. So our bylaw is very focused on this rural context, as well as some of the villages and obviously the shoreline areas. In terms of what zoning looks like in the city today, as I said, there's 14 rural zoning bylaws that are applicable, comprising 202 separate zone classifications. I won't read them all off, but 67 distinct residential zones and so on. As you can see, there's a lot of redundancy between these bylaws. So there's a lot of benefit to bringing them together. And of course, there are also over 1,200 site-specific exception zones. So an exception zone is a zone that applies usually to a specific piece of land. And that's typically an outcome of a zoning bylaw amendment process, where a landowner has made an application to the city council has approved it, and they've received site-specific zoning permissions or restrictions. So there's over 1,200 of them. And by the way, that's totally normal. It's very normal for a municipality to accumulate many hundreds of exception zones. But this project represented an opportunity to review those and to simplify things. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our zoning bylaw is premised on really three very key documents. Our discussion paper, which outlines some of the issues to be addressed in the project and a general sense of principles. There's a methodology and key issues report. And then there's also the official plan. So I would say all of those three things have been very significant inputs to this document. Next slide. So the discussion paper, and by the way, you can review all these documents on the city's website. I'm actually quite proud of all of the background work that we've done on this project, because I've done a lot of zoning bylaw reviews in other municipalities, and I think this is probably one of the best documented zoning bylaw reviews that I've worked on. The discussion paper is a great go-to for understanding the relationship of the official plan and the zoning bylaw, and for understanding, what the whole purpose of this project was. The issues and methodology report, I think, is quite interesting for people that want to understand how exactly we merged the bylaws, how they came together, how we simplified the zones, and what were sort of our thresholds for when we decided the zones were similar enough to bring them together. So we've done a great job, I think, of detailing all of that documentation. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the official plan a whole bunch of times, and I certainly appreciate council will know what the official plan is, but I think there are some members of the public that may not be aware of the official plan or what its purpose is. The official plan is a very key planning document that really drives land use planning within the city. It sets out a vision, goals, and general development permissions. So it'll have land use designations, it'll have general statements about what's permitted where in the city. And the relationship of the two documents is that the zoning bylaw has to conform to those policies. So if there's an area of land in the city where a use is not permitted, then we needed to make sure that the zoning bylaw was not permitting that use. So we as much as possible, we wanted to make the document say the same thing, but the zoning bylaw also has to be much more detailed than the official plan for it to be a useful regulatory document. And as I said earlier, it is a legislated requirement for us to conform to the official plan. So that's something that has really driven a lot of decision making on this process. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Matt, and he'll take us through some of the highlights and some of the changes made to the zoning.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and John as well. Good afternoon to the Planning Advisory Committee. As Bobby said, my name is Matt Rodriguez with WSP, and I'll walk through some of the highlights of the new rural zoning bylaw. Some of this might be familiar to those who have been involved in the process, but we'll also walk through some of the key changes since the second draft of the rural zoning bylaw was released a few short weeks ago. Next slide, please. As Bobby alluded to, one of the key outcomes of this process is to consolidate the existing zones. On the right-hand side of the screen is a bit of a decision matrix or flow chart. Lots of steps in there and perhaps hard to read at a small scale. But what I want to highlight with this, and you can find a higher resolution copy in our issues and methodology report, is that we followed a sort of a step-by-step process to review and harmonize some of those existing zones. We also set out a process to harmonize the definitions. So each of the bylaws has a glossary where a number of terms are defined, and we followed a process to do that, as well as consolidating the general provisions and administrative provisions. And so this deals with things like legal non-conforming or existing uses, accessory uses, and other sort of area-wide regulations that may not apply to a specific zone, but to more than one or perhaps even the entire rural area. In terms of how we approach the consolidation, it was important to set out a few key principles. The first is to establish consistency and eliminate duplication, to simplify and modernize the names of uses. So for example, some of the bylaws would say the word single family home or single family dwelling, whereas we're moving towards single attached dwelling and speaking to what that use or what that structure is. Ensuring consistency with the official plan. So there was a need to review and understand the policies and different land use designations of the official plan and guide our consolidation of zones. And also importantly, to carry forward existing property permissions subject to the official plan. And so the documentation on the right, allows us to understand, where those changes might be to existing property permissions. Next slide. I will actually say before I speak to this that on the project webpage, there is a table that does show how the existing zones have been merged into new zones. And so if you're wondering, hey, I was zoned CF in the Somerville zoning bylaw, as an example, what zone am I in now? That table will show you what new zone might apply to your property, but again, also best to check the zoning schedules. So stemming from that consolidation, we were able to take those 14 zoning bylaws and 202 zones and bring them together into one bylaw with 34 zones. This is a significant undertaking, and really, pleased with how it shaped up and how it came together. And I think overall a really fantastic and important win for city staff, for city council, members of the public, and the development community alike to understand the zoning regulations that apply in the rural area. Next slide, please. So once we had this main bylaw that applied to the rural area, we then took the time and the opportunity to review those exception zones that Bobby reviewed. Again, we established a fairly detailed flow chart or decision chart here of how we might either keep, remove, or otherwise modify an existing exception. We went through all 1,200 plus exception zones, and we reviewed those against the second draft rural zoning bylaw. And so that allowed us to confirm and make sure we were good with the main zones before we got too deep into the 1,200 exception zones, and to release those as part of the second draft. This approach was followed, and really site-specific exceptions were only removed in limited instances where it met the criteria set out in our report and in this flowchart. Retained site-specific exceptions were formatted into a consistent structure, and so for example, each of the existing bylaws might have had a different common way of wording something or structuring or numbering. We followed a new and streamlined approach for all 1,200, and we'll work with city staff sort of following adoption to make sure that that is transferred and that we're able to keep that updated as the bylaw continues to evolve following adoption. Next slide, please. For those who haven't had a chance to look at the bylaw is divided into 14 sections. The first couple chapters, 1 and 2, deal with administration and set out how to interpret the zone schedules. Chapter 3 is our definitions. Chapter 4 is general provisions, so those largely apply rural area wide or to a specific zone or series of zones. Parking and loading facilities, and then followed by the zone chapters, so residential, agricultural, commercial, industrial, environmental protection and open space, community use, and future development. All of the exceptions are contained in Chapter 13, and then Chapter 14 is the enactment. And so once this is adopted by Council, it'll sort of give teeth to the actual enactment of the rural zoning bylaw. Alongside the bylaw is a series of updated zone maps and schedules, which show the zoning regulations that apply to a property. And so there's 3 schedules, A, B, and C. Schedule A shows the zones, so the most basic zone information. Are you a residential zone? Are you a commercial zone? Or say an agricultural zone? Schedule B applies additional regulations that protect water resources around wellhead protection areas. And so there's regulations in the bylaw as well as on this schedule that show where the different regulations apply, and so should be consulted to help understand the regulations on your property. Schedule C relates specifically to the Burnt River floodplain. As some may be aware, the existing bylaw along the Burnt River deals with floodplain elevation cross sections, and so we have worked closely with the Conservation Authority to update the mapping and those elevations alongside their work. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but again, just wanted to reiterate that throughout the past sort of 3.5, almost 4 years, this zoning bylaw has been developed in response to public input and policy. The first draft was released 18 months ago in January of 2022. Followed by the second draft back in March, so about 5 months ago, and then most recently in July of 2022. And after each milestone, we've received great public and community input that has been reflected or considered in the next iteration. Next slide. Again, a ton of consultation and great community engagement through this process, starting with in-person public open houses in September of 2019. There was also a rural zoning bylaw review task force that was struck, as well as outreach to technical agencies and advisory committee, including groups such as conservation authorities and school boards. The city's been maintaining a fantastic website on the Jump in Kawartha Lakes with all of the reports and iterations of the bylaw and important links and notifications. And as John alluded to, a number of public open houses. February of last year, we had some great workshops about waterfront and agricultural zoning, followed by a public open house in April of that year. In March 2022, we had 3 public open houses to introduce the draft rural zoning bylaw. In June, we had a separate open house to seek input on the Woodville zoning bylaw consolidation, followed by a statutory public open house in April of this year. Over the spring, we had workshops with economic development planning staff, again, to really refine our recommendations in the bylaw itself. And so while the process has been spanned across several years, we have been engaging with the community, key stakeholders, staff, and perhaps what's missing from this is also council and the planning advisory committee at key milestones as well. Next slide, please. Again, one of the key drivers of this exercise is responding to policy. So through our agricultural workshop, we honed in on an approach to on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses, sort of workshopped how we can make this work with the city's current official plan policy framework. We focused on identifying the different types of on-farm diversified uses, and agriculture-related uses that we could permit, and accompanying standards for the rural zoning bylaw. We then had a fantastic workshop related to waterfront zoning, where we talked about setbacks on the water's edge, provisions for accessory structures, docks, and boathouses, and the lake. shoreline naturalization and what that could look like in Kawartha Lakes, and you'll see regulations related to that in the new zoning bylaw. Again, this workshop culminated in us identifying an approach to implement the policies of the official plan in the zoning bylaw. Next slide. So those are some of our highlights and key wins, and I think represent great milestones and great sort of steps forward for the city. Since releasing the second draft, we made a number of changes, and so on the next couple slides, we'll just walk through at a high level what some of those key changes are. The first is that defined terms have been bolded instead of underlined, improving bylaw accessibility. Additions and refinements to defined terms have been made throughout the bylaw in response to planning and economic development staff comments. We comprehensively reviewed general provisions for clarity and interpretation, specifically in this iteration related to home occupations and home industries, as well as accessory buildings and structures. We expanded bicycle parking requirements to new uses in the community, and we see this work aligning quite well with the city's ongoing trails master plan and active transportation work as they all work together. In terms of permitted uses, we reviewed the permitted uses in the agriculture consolidation or AC zone to better align with the agriculture zone. And we also reviewed the permitted uses in the future development or FD zone to allow for greater flexibility in sort of that shorter term as those areas evolve. Next slide. A preamble and user guide has been added to the zoning bylaw to support interpretation. So if you're new to the zoning bylaw or you want to understand how to find the zoning on your property, this user guide is a really helpful resource and should be consulted. But again, city staff are always there to help and check those. Provisions for transition between the existing and new bylaws were included. I already mentioned the inclusion of bicycle parking standards, and we were also excited and happy to work with the folks at the Longford Reserve and their team to update and confirm applicable zoning standards, and that was a really collaborative approach, and really pleased with how that process shaped up. Additional residential dwelling unit or ARU regulations have been updated to align with Bill 23 changes, as Planning Advisory Committee may be aware. That was changed back in the fall. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Bobby just to walk over some next steps from here and in the rural zoning bylaw review.
Thanks very much. Next slide, John. So looking ahead, one of the points I wanted to make is that as I've said so many times, one of our key objectives is to conform to the city's official plan. And that's because the existing zoning bylaws are a lot older than the city's current official plan. However, I would say that I do think the city is in need of an official plan update to reflect some more modern provincial terminology, as is so many municipalities in Ontario. And so going through the rural zoning bylaw review process has, I think, yielded some outputs and some further actions for the city to consider as part of the official plan review. So some improvements and clarity around policies for on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses. The official plan does speak to those uses, but it doesn't quite use the same terminology, and it doesn't incorporate some of the latest provincial criteria. Tiny homes, a bit more clarity around how those are permitted. Future development areas within hamlets and what the intent is there. Bolstering policies for agritourism, I think would be very beneficial for the official plan review. And then also reviewing home-based business and home industry policies for alignment with provincial requirements. So we do think that there are a lot of good outcomes from this process that'll feed into that official plan review. Some next steps. So we are asking for comments to be received by Friday, September 1st of this year, and that'll help us to ensure that we stay on track and work towards a conclusion to this very major process. Once we receive all the comments, we'll work to prepare the final zoning bylaw for council adoption, and our intent is to bring that forward sometime in the fall of 2023, likely landing in September or in October or November. Next slide. So as Matt mentioned, there's a lot of great information on the city's website, jumpinkawarthalakes.ca. All of the reports that we've been describing, the zoning bylaw itself, including the zoning maps, are available on that website. You're welcome to register to continue to receive project updates as it moves forward towards this approval process. And of course, residents can contact John directly to have a conversation or to submit written comments. So that concludes the presentation. I thank you very much for listening, and we very much look forward to the questions and the discussion today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and your team for a great presentation. I'm sure it's all pretty straightforward. I can't imagine there'd be any questions coming out of something like that. But just in case there are, Mayor Elmsley, do you want to start us off with the questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Yeah, I think this is some great work that's been done here, not only by WSP, but also by our staff and by the task force and the residents out there who have engaged and brought forward their thoughts and ideas on how things should look. And I think this is a tremendous step forward for the city of Kawartha Lakes. It's taken us some 22 years in order to get here. And I think it's going to serve us well. And as was said, you're not going to get it perfect right out of the box. So, you know, there is more work to be done, and we know that. I did have one question. I submitted some questions to Mr. Hawley and to Ms. Barry. So I won't ask them again because I know I'll get a response that way, and they can be considered on the public record as we go forward. But it struck me while I was listening to the presentation, we have a number of master plans. Is there a relationship between the master plans and the zoning bylaw, or are they completely separate documents, and would one overshadow the other? But I don't know who can answer that.
Jonathan, do you want to take a shot at that, or
yeah,
me,
sure.
or whoever on the team?
Just to confirm, master plan, are we talking a development plan, or are we talking like the active transportation master plan?
That is certainly
underway.
There's certainly one that came to my mind was the active transportation plan and how it might fit in with this, and whether they were at odds or they had been considered one to the other.
Yep, no, great question. And through the chair to the mayor, yes. Short answer is yes. The master plan, the active transportation master plan specifically, has been something that because I'm working on both projects, I've definitely ensured that there is that harmony there, that symmetry where it's appropriate. And I say that because the nature of a zoning bylaw sometimes isn't, it can only do so much when it comes to implementing, say, or assisting the implementation of a larger policy document or a policy sort of master plan like the active transportation master plan. That being said, because the zoning bylaw review is sort of before the completion and the approval of the active transportation master plan, amendments to the zoning bylaw informed by the policies within the ATMP are certainly not unreasonable. I think there are a few recommendations actually in the ATMP that will trigger or support or facilitate some amendments to the zoning bylaw. As well as the official plan. So short answer to the question is yes, master plans have been considered through the development of the rural zoning bylaw review.
Jason?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the implementation of this is going to potentially pass council in the fall. What's the process going to be for grandfathering between two? Like if someone has a current application, a pending application, or if there's an omission or grandfathering, just the process for people.
Through the chair, that's a great question. Obviously, we're going to have to take a look and see what new development sort of walks through the door. I mean, obviously, things that are in queue right now will be processed under their current zoning bylaws. But any new development applications, obviously, we're going to try to process them under the new zoning bylaw as best we can. Because we think new zoning bylaw has a lot better sets of regulations, is more progressive in that sense. So I think there's probably going to come a cutoff point where in our pre-consultation, we're going to advise people, look, you might want to wait for the new zoning bylaw to come through. It might have a better regulatory framework and your development might need less amendments or need fewer amendments to the different regulations. So to answer your question, existing developments will still fall under the existing zoning bylaws unless it sort of straddles, then we'll have to consider it under the new rural zoning bylaw. But those are details that we will work out with the development community. So.
Sorry, just one follow-up. So what happens if there is, sorry to say this, an omission, or if there's a current use that's not noted on new? Like, I think it's all been dealt with for the existing, but realistically, if there's something noted that says X property could do whatever, and on the new one there's a restriction, would that mean someone would have to reapply or change, or how is that dealt with?
I think we've made a lot of efforts to not get to that point. Obviously, as I said, we might not get it perfect, so those are things that we'll have to take a look at as they arise case by case. So.
And just to Richard's point, we through the exception zone review, as we described, there's a lot, and we did our best to ensure that no permissions were necessarily taken away. If anything was existing through an exception zone and it pertained to a unique use or very unique development standard, that was carried forward. So we did by and large consider or carry over all of the sort of outliers, if you will. And through the zoning bylaw harmonization exercise, we did also do our best to make sure that we weren't limiting development rights through that exercise.
Mike?
Through the chair, if I might add something.
Okay, sure, go ahead. Something further to add?
I just want to maybe point to the committee's attention, just for as you're reviewing the bylaw. There's certainly lots of content in there. That Chapter 1 in Section 1.5 has provisions around transition. So there are provisions in the bylaw that speak to how existing planning applications or building permits will be treated or should be treated with the adoption of the bylaw. And then in Section 4 of the bylaw, there are regulations related to sort of non-conforming or non-complying uses, and where there might be discrepancies between the current framework and any previous zoning that might be in place. So those will help staff resolve those issues and sort of set a framework for the new zoning bylaw.
Perfect. I guess my question is leading, are we going to get the same applications back again? Is there a mechanism to resolve concerns before they come here?
Through the chair, obviously, if there are any issues, we will have to figure out how to resolve them. I don't anticipate that there will be many. As I said, we've done our best to make sure that doesn't happen, because that's one of the foundations of the work, is not to create a lot of legal non-conforming scenarios, because you really don't want to have those. You want to have people get the zoning that fits their property, makes the development work. You don't want to create a lot of non-conforming situations, because they're the ones that then bring forward the minor variances and they need zoning bylaws later on. So we did our utmost to not to do that. If anything, one of we had a whole shopping list of issues that was given to the zoning bylaw team at the outset. And we really sort of went through what are some of the things that we're getting in our minor variance applications, what are the things we're getting in our zoning bylaw applications, what are some of the issues that we've dealt with as staff in dealing with the zoning bylaws, and we put that all together in a list and gave it to WSP. Some of the comments that the mayor provided to us, we certainly noted, you know, garages in front yards. Yes, where there's a deep property, they should be allowed in the front yard as of right, not put in the backyard. We had a number of zones that limited, you know, you're allowed a whole list of uses, but you could only have 2 or 3. And I kind of, that was always very confusing to me. So what we've tried to do is if anything, expand the range of uses throughout the zones so that we eliminate the need for a lot of rezoning applications. So that was our goal and our intent with the zoning bylaw.
Mr. Mayor, I think this would be a good chance for your councillors that are present here for an assignment to make sure they are aware of all the things in the 100 pages here before we get here in September. I think that, yeah. Mike, you had a question.
I did. Thank you very much. Let me just say that as I wrote to you in an email this morning, I was absolutely gobsmacked by the work that you did with this. As a realtor, I've been working with these zoning bylaws. These are just 3 of them for 20 years. And every time that you have a house or a cottage for sale, you're going through these, trying to figure out what it was. So the way you simplified and combined all of these is just amazing. And I'm still licensed, but I am retired, but thinking of going back, you know, this, I think I can work with these. So in the email that I sent this morning, I did mention a few technicalities that I thought might be addressed. I don't know if you received that email. I sent it to Leah and to Richard. You have
yes,
that?
I can confirm that we all received it. Absolutely.
Okay, well, you can get back to me on that. I understand. So, sure. Because I asked just about boathouses and whether there'd be a little bit of a clarification on that boathouses, the similar as cabins, should not contain cooking or sanitary facilities, rather than just not be not a household habitat or what it's referred to. Asked about RVs, that they can be used as a seasonal dwelling, that they're, as a seasonal dwelling are not permitted unless otherwise permitted, and it was confusing to me about that, when it is, when it wasn't. Shipping containers, I think there's more of that because as some others have talked about, the tiny houses are coming in, and can shipping containers be converted into tiny homes? And I don't know whether that's something can be addressed or has been, and I didn't understand it. The ARUs, the section, they talk about mobile homes that can be used for additional residence dwellings if they meet all the, if they comply with the building codes and things. So if you give me answers to that. One that you can answer now that I might ask is, you in this section about improved public streets, that's section 411, it does not address, it says that this section does not address homes built on private roads. And I think in the city of Kawartha Lakes, we have a lot of cottages with private roads. Is that something I missed, or is that addressed somewhere else? Cottages or homes on private roads?
Through the chair, I was concerned that you were this is the one you were gonna bring up out of all of them. We had
there's more to come. There's more to come.
Okay, no, maybe Richard can support on this one, but we did wrestle back and forth with this provision and how we sort of treat private versus public roads. What is a private road? What is a public road? And sort of the nuances that go along with that. So might not be able to answer this one on the spot, Mike. We'll take this one away and follow up with you in that email.
Matthew, did you want to respond?
No, I was just going to add that there is some provisions in Section 411 related to private right-of-ways in terms of some flexibility there. But as John said, we are taking a comprehensive look at this section.
Thank you. Yeah, the other one was similar about garden suites on the improved public streets. And I think we have already, maybe it's through committee of adjustment, but I think we've done it as well as we've approved ARUs on properties that have septic systems or not on a public street. So I just thought that was something that I didn't understand. Now, the main thing that I wanted to get to is, of course, what we've chatted about in Kobukong and in Zoom meetings is the naturalization. Having naturalization 30 meters back from the waterfront, the shoreline, I think with only 25% of that accessible to pathways or for people to play or to do things, I think it is just it's an overkill. I can't picture, I live on Cameron Lake. We look after the waterfront and there's some naturalization that most people do for a meter, 3 meters, whatever, along their shoreline, but going 100 feet back with weeds or naturalization. I was driving over today and I was thinking, what if, looking at the side of Highway 35, what if my backyard looked like that? My front yard, and I'm taking my grandchildren and saying, okay, just walk down the path. The dock is over here. Now you'll see it in a minute. You'll see it. I just think and I know you've had a number of committees, but I just don't understand how you got to that 30-meter naturalization. It's astounding to me.
Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm pulling up the official plan because that is one of the regulations that we carried forward from the City of Kawartha Lake's official plan. I just want to make sure I'm referencing the right section here. If you have another question, Mike, feel free to ask it here while I pull this up.
Yeah, the only other comment I had was the zoning maps are just outstanding. It's incredible. The Schedule 8, the depth and the detail that's there is so helpful. I am so pleased with the report and with the new zoning, the whole bylaw. I think it's a real attribute for realtors, for everybody, for the public to use, and it's so readable. It's excellent. It really is excellent. So you can get back to me on that other. Yeah.
No worries. So that would be within section 3.11, water setback and accessory uses. The first policy there, 3.11.1, indicating that all building structures and septic systems shall be located a minimum of 30 meters from the high water mark, and the setback shall be maintained in its natural state. So as Bobby flagged earlier, there were a few policies that could use some tweaking down the road when the municipality updates its official plan. And this is something that we certainly consider being one of them to better align with not only best practices and provincial policy, but also with the guidelines and the requirements from conservation authorities.
When you have that worked out, you come over and talk to my neighbors.
Sure, absolutely. And maybe up just to for anyone who's watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. No, there is these policies do not apply retroactively. So this would be for new development. That 30-meter setback and shoreline naturalization would occur.
I think when nothing else works, Mike, you just tell them to phone the mayor. Ron, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Jonathan or Richard, thanks for your presentation. I know I was at one of the first meetings we had held in Downeyville, and I think it was May of 2019, and when we started the whole process, but we didn't expect to be, different reasons beyond our control it took a little longer, but there's a lot of work involved in this. One of the key words that I see in this is harmonization. I'll give you an example. In one of the maps here that you just showed, there's what they call 4 Points Road, not far from where I am, where you have, it's the only place in City Kawartha Lakes where you have 4 townships hit each other. You have Verlem, Fenelon, Emily, and Ops, and they're within, you could touch each other if you wanted to. But I've had issues where if you're in Verlem and you're in Fenelon Falls, or Fenelon Township, I actually live in Fenelon Township, Fenelon South, or Ops, or Emily, as an example, you have different setbacks, and it's caused issues. So these things will be harmonized. How quickly, say theoretically, if it's past, say, October, November, will everything be, how long does it take to harmonize all the rules? Because, would it be a matter of just immediate? Or is it something that has to be phased in because you've got so many different townships, and they had these setbacks for different reasons, but how will that work, the timing of it, if you possibly knew that? Thanks.
Yeah. No, great question through the chair to Councillor Ashmore. So all that harmonization, the homework has been done, basically. So those new rules and regulations, as you know, are in the bylaw, and once we return with the final bylaw in hand with a recommendation for approval, pending any appeals, hopefully we're all being optimistic on that one. It would essentially be in effect closing or following that. We would issue a public notice of passing, just like any other zoning bylaw amendment that's site specific or what have you, and it would be in effect.
Thanks for that. And just one final question. Mike had mentioned about naturalization of shorelines. That's a really big issue, especially over on Pigeon Lake, where you already have like 200 or 300 feet of so-called naturalized waterfront that people want to navigate. They have a right to get out there to navigate onto the lake, but basically they're just choked right in. And then the hope is that was a temporary thing, but now with this, would that be a permanent feature now? They call it naturalization. Now some people call it weeds, but and it's really serious as far as getting your navigable right to get out to your lake, to get out to the lake, or even enjoy the lake or use it for other purposes. Just is that that's what I'm not quite I'm going to say sold on, but I guess you could say that. But this naturalization, does it apply to is it all one rule for every lake and every shoreline in the city?
To Councillor Ashmore, yes. So there are some relief. There is some relief. Pardon me. In the bylaw for if there are legal instances of a legal non-complying water setback. They're basically if because we have the requirement of 30 meters, but if it's less than that, there is some relief there. And again, it would not apply retroactively. This would apply to anyone coming for a permit after the zoning bylaw is approved and in effect. So there is some relief there, some exemptions or options for folks who would have a legal non-conforming or non-complying structure. And there is also, you mentioned access to the water. There are provisions that allow for some of that area to be disturbed. So it's not the whole lot line. It's not the entire shore lot line that is required to be maintained or protected. It is just a percentage of that. So within that other percentage, the remaining, you could have your access to the water.
Okay.
Are there any further questions from Councillor McDonald?
Yeah, thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Just one question might be for Mr. Holloway. Are there individuals out there now that have been working on zoning changes the last month or years that when this is changed, they'll be turned down?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, obviously, if we have existing applications in the queue and they are being reviewed on their merits, they don't get turned down in that sense. The current, or this zoning bylaw, is going to conform to the official plan. And basically, existing applications that are currently in the queue also need to conform to the official plan. So I can't see that we would turn applicants down based on the new zoning bylaw.
Mayor Elmsley?
Would you like a motion?
Shortly, I'm just a couple quick questions. I'll get right back to you. 1 second. I just have a couple quick questions. How difficult was it to deal with the 1,200 exception zones? How did you get through all that? And I realized that you've come to a conclusion.
I can chime in on that, Mr. Chair. It was certainly a large undertaking, and quite honestly, it was a manual process of reviewing the exceptions. I would say our first step was really to do sort of what we call the screening, to look at the exception and just put it into context. You know, how old is the exception? Has it been developed? And does it conform to the official plan? And on the basis of that analysis, we made a decision about whether to delete the exception or keep it. And as Richard alluded to, we tried to err on the side of caution and to be conservative. So in large part, we carried forward a lot of the exceptions. And then after that, the process was really just about bringing them into a consolidated document and formatting them consistently. So a lot of work, I think, is the short answer to your question.
Thank you. And further up on the tiny homes, there's a conversation out there now. First of all, I guess there's not going to be a minimum standard as I read it in here on buildings, basically. And the other thing is that apparently they're building a recreational trailer or vehicle now that's going to be able to live in 12 months a year. So a standard's going to be upgraded. So are you familiar with they could be considered a tiny home, a recreational vehicle, and they would be able to be lived in, I guess would be the question year round. If you have a thought on that.
Mr. Chair, I can start on that and see if city staff would like to chime in. I haven't personally heard of that. I do think our bylaw considers tiny homes in the context of additional residential units. So there is some permission for that, and I think I don't know that our bylaw defines it specifically, but our bylaw doesn't really get into the specifics of construction method and that sort of thing. That's really more of a building code issue. So the zoning bylaw is really more concerned with the setbacks and the height and that sort of thing. So I would say generally it does contemplate it, but as I mentioned in the presentation too, we thought that there was a need for the city to be looking at its official plan policies with respect to tiny homes and to perhaps elaborate on them. And I think once the city completes that review of the official plan and updates those policies, that'll probably precipitate some further refinements to the zoning bylaw down the road. It's been my experience typically that after a new zoning bylaw gets passed, there's usually like a housekeeping amendment that has to come forward about a year later. And that's when the city can kind of respond to some of the little nuances, maybe even recognizing some legal non-conforming situations if it wants to. So just as sort of a final thought, I do see a housekeeping amendment being a good process for keeping track of little issues with this new bylaw and then resolving them pretty quickly. And that's quite typical with a brand new zoning bylaw.
Thank you for that. Mayor Elmsley?
I'll also jump in on there. Yeah, so based on your description, that would be considered a recreational vehicle. Of course, would have to maybe confirm that. But right now in the bylaw, dwelling unit, the definition for dwelling unit does not include a recreational vehicle. So on that, given that, it sounds like the type of RV dwelling that you have described would not be permitted as of right, as as an ARU or a primary dwelling.
Thank you. Yeah.
Through the chair, to answer the question, there's also another option of mobile homes, and we've had a number of mobile homes, mobile home parks in the past throughout rural areas. Those are traditionally something of more of a rural type of use. And our official plan, I would say, is probably wouldn't necessarily permit a mobile home in an urban area, say, for example, in an urban subdivision in that sense. So I don't believe that our zoning bylaw currently would allow, sort of a mobile home within a residential area in that sense. So that is a trailer that is sort of brought on site and then the wheels are taken off, but you can't live in that permanently. So the idea is that, you could put one or two pieces together and voila, there's your home. I don't believe that we've necessarily considered that as part of this rural zoning bylaw to allow that sort of more in residential zones. I think if that's a direction that council may want to go to, as Bobby alluded to, there's usually a housekeeping amendment that is done, a year or two later. There's also some policy directions that Bobby had sort of provided us that we sort of take a look at and do some further investigation. So, obviously, if this is something that council would like to see, that we allow even more housing options, even in hamlet or settlement areas, then that's what we could take a look at to provide those options.
Thanks for that, Richard. Mayor Elmsley?
I'll give you a motion as printed.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Jason, seconded. And the motion is that the rural zoning bylaw statutory public meeting be received and the report plan 2023-039 and the draft rural zoning bylaw be referred back to staff for further recommendations, report to be presented to the Planning Advisory Committee upon receipt and review of all agency and department, council, and public comments. Okay. Maybe I guess I should have called for public comments, even though we don't think that anybody want to make them. Does anybody wish to speak to the Rural Zoning Bylaw Committee report today? Does anybody wish to speak to the committee report today? Does anybody wish to speak to the committee report today? Thanks, Joel. Seeing none, the coast is clear. So mover and a seconder, all those in favor? That's carried unanimously. Thank you so much for, and thank you for the work for staff and for all your work for years and weeks and months. So anyways, and hopefully this fall we'll get it passed and move on to a new, it's going to be a great relief for, as Mike said, for everybody, for our staff, for the public, and for everybody. So well done. I think the next item is the public meeting arising. I'm running with that part, but we're going to 4.1. No deputations? There's one deputation? Okay, you're up, Kaylee. Can you hear us?
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Kaylee Robbins. I'm the planning agent on behalf of the owner for the rezoning and subdivision application on Elkhorn Drive, which is item 6.1 today. I would just like to identify that we've reviewed the staff report and we agree with the recommendations, and we hope to keep this project moving forward, and I am available should there be any questions. And that's all for me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. So I guess with that, we will, any questions of Kaylee? They'll like to come later, Kelly, after the report, if there are any. A motion to receive the deputation. Mayor Elmsley, second Councillor Ashmore. All those in favor? That's carried. No correspondence, is there? Okay, and then the next one is the planning application to amend the town Lindsay zoning bylaw. And Richard, you're on deck.
Good afternoon, members of the committee and any members of the public that may be attending, either here or in Zoom. This is a returning application. This is an application, maybe I'll point up to this screen here and just kind of show you where it is. I'm not sure if, oh, there it goes. So this is the application area here in sort of in gray. Some of the other area here, which was part of the woods of Jennings Creek, which went all the way almost over to Angela and has already been developed. There was a fairly large tract of land, valley land in along the river here, which the city has received already. There were some other blocks here that went through a previous application, and they have approval as well. These two blocks here, the developer has chosen to wait until this project is developed or approved as well, and then they will construct everything all at once. There does make some sense in that, and we will, through this application, we'll be getting Alcorn Drive extended through all the way to Lindsay Street North. This application will also see the extension of Victoria Avenue north into the Springdale Gardens application. There are some other additional lands that the owner owns in this area here, not subject to this application. They'll be coming back with a separate application in the future as well, and this block here as well. But the good news with this application, as well as with the Fernbrook Homes application, which is just off here, is that we're now starting to get this road network all constructed. So we're going to get Alcorn Road across to Lindsay Street North. We are going to get Victoria Avenue North constructed all the way into the Springdale subdivision. So there's a number of big sort of strategic transportation pieces that are coming along with this approval as well. Again, this subdivision approval really dates back to, I believe, about 2008 when Dunster Investments first submitted it. It was approved back by the OMB a number of years ago. He didn't manage to construct the whole thing. It was picked up by Regis Homes, I believe, in 2017 and 2021. They came in with development applications for this property here. This area was subject to a public meeting on February 9th of 2022. There were a couple of people that came out to the public meeting. However, there wasn't a lot of public objection to the proposal. It is for a rezoning application and draft plan of subdivision. They are looking to construct 63 units of residential development. So there are a number of singles along here, semis along here, and then there's townhouse blocks in this area. It's about 40 townhouses, 14 semi-detached units, and 9 single detached units as well. The property is designated residential in the Town of Lindsay official plan, and it has existing zoning, which is being revised through this application. The other part of the application is the developer wishes to have the H1 symbol removed, the H1 holding symbol removed. That is a holding symbol that requires payment of the Northwest Trunk Black capital charge. Since that project is already completed, there's really no need to have the holding symbol on in their mind. The part of the zoning bylaw is to increase the lot coverage for singles. And the other part of it is to allow for covered decks and porches on the rear yards We've had a number of minor variances in that area on Elkhorn Drive. So we've asked a lot of the developers coming on stream now, Tribute's one, and the Feely Group is another one, to give us some zoning regulations around backyards and decks encroaching into backyards, because we're finding people want larger decks. And to avoid unnecessary minor variances, to put people through that, we asked Kaylee to come up with some zoning provisions as well, which they have done. They are also in the zoning bylaw as well for this project. As part of the application submission, there were a number of updated reports provided, obviously planning reports, a draft zoning bylaw, revised draft plan of subdivision, and phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. This information was really augmented the original application, which had a lot of the engineering background documentation with it. From a provincial policy perspective, obviously the development hits all of the various policy objectives of the province in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the provincial policy statement. Obviously, we're directing development to urban settlement areas, protecting the environment, utilizing existing servicing, and providing additional housing options and a variety of housing options for our citizens. From the official plan perspective, it meets the requirements of the official plan. It meets the use permissions by providing single, semis, and townhouses, which are permitted uses. It also hits the density targets for those different types of uses as well. And it meets the height and character of the existing area as well. So from that perspective, the application does conform to provincial policy as well as local policy as well. The zoning bylaw is really to decrease the front yard setbacks from 7.5 meters to 6 meters, and that's to bring the houses closer to the street as opposed to having them set back 7.5 meters. The houses, the residential portion of the dwelling comes to within 4.5 meters. The garage is set back at 6, so you have a bit of a staggered effect. Most people don't use the front yard, so why not add that into the backyard and have some slightly bigger backyards and have a slightly bigger building footprint as well. Again, maximum lot coverage is increased for single detached lots only from 35 to 40%, and there are specific zoning provisions that allow better or increased decks in backyards. With respect to the holding provision, we did contact the engineering department. They didn't see any problem with having that provision removed, because when the developer comes through and implements their subdivision agreement, the treasurer takes care of all the payments, so they have to pay their share, whatever share is outstanding on the Northwest Trunk Bis Black capital charge. So that gets caught in there, so there's not really any need to have the holding provision in place anymore. As I mentioned, the application was circulated to all departments, relevant departments. All of the comments that we received from the engineering department, conservation authority, any First Nations or building department, fire department, those have all been included in the conditions of draft plan approval. The conditions of draft plan approval for the subdivision are fairly standard. There are some additions, but generally they're fairly standard, and they reflect all of the comments and conditions that were provided to us through the circulation of the revised application. One of the issues I will note is that obviously, let me just, Joel, maybe if you want to go back to the previous slide. Pointer doesn't seem to want to go here. There we go. So Victoria Avenue goes up to here right now and stops at Elkhorn. So we have a bit of a naming issue, because up here what's the name up there? It is William Street North. So that's one of the conditions that we're going to have to work through. Do we bring Victoria Avenue North all the way up here, or do we just rename this part William Street North and just have Elkhorn as the cutoff between the two street names? There's pros and cons to both approaches. If you bring Victoria as a street name all the way up, it creates that continuity of the street name. However, if you do that, then people that have an existing William Street North address will have to change their addresses. If you bring William Street North South down to Elkhorn, obviously there's then it doesn't affect people in the Springdale subdivision, but you've got then a street that's split by two names. So that is something that we will have to work through. We do have a street naming policy in place, and we will work through that policy to get to a resolution of this issue. Again, as mentioned, the conditions of draft plan approval have been vetted by all the major departments that generally provide input into these matters. The zoning bylaw is also attached for your consideration. From that perspective, we feel the application represents good planning and respectfully request that it be forwarded to council for approval. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Richard. Members of committee, any questions of Richard on the report before us? Seeing none, I guess we have members. Is anybody watching, or do we ask? Not a public meeting, so we just don't have to worry about that. I just have the one question. You just mentioned that staff is going to make a decision on the renaming of how the streets are going to be named. If there is an expense occurs as a result of that, who would pay for that? Would that be us, or would we put a footnote in here, or would we ask the Regis people?
To the chair, that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure on in terms of the policy, how that works, whether or not if we have a public meeting, if it's a street renaming, if we were to rename William Street North to Victoria North, I take it then we have a public meeting on that, and then obviously that matter would come out from that perspective. Correct, Joel?
Comment, Joel?
Yeah, so according to the street naming policy, a continuous street shall have a continuous name. So if the proposal as presented was approved, the street in Springdale Gardens would, the most logical solution would be for it to be renamed to Victoria Avenue North. Now, looking back into the history of this street in Springdale Gardens, this street has already changed its name once. It was initially named Lindsay Street North on the map that you can see here. It is registered here, and you can see that it is registered as Lindsay Street and then identified again as William Street North. So in the development of Springdale Gardens, it was contemplated that William Street would connect to the other end of William Street, which is over here. So the alignment of the street would suggest that the folks in William Street North would avoid most navigation issues and for emergency services and general flow of traffic. It would make the most sense to rename the street, and if it is renamed, the policy contemplates that the initiator of the renaming is responsible for the payment or for the costs associated. So we had a recent issue where on Highway 7 was realigned 2 new streets were created because of this, City View Heights and Falaise Court, and the MTO was responsible for the costs. Now, the good thing is that both Victoria and William Street both start at Kent Street, and so the numbering is consistent. So I've confirmed with GIS that should the folks on William Street North require a name change to Victoria Avenue North, their numbers would stay the same. So their house numbers would be consistent, and the numbering along Victoria Avenue would make sense, so that you wouldn't have a giant gap. So the numbers at the end of Victoria Avenue are around the 300s, and in William Street North in Springdale, they are around the 400s. So there shouldn't be a requirement for them to change their physical house numbers. It would just need to be the street name itself. To my understanding, none of the neighborhood has been notified unless they were in the 120-meter commenting area. But as part of our street naming process, we would require notice to go out to every new property, every property owner on the street being renamed, and advise of the new proposed name. It would have to go to a meeting. There would be a period of time to allow for additional comments, and a notice would need to be made according to the city's notice bylaw to rename the street. So complicated process, yes. Possible, yes. And we've done it before in the past, and certainly the folks on William Street North have done it before. So that is the most logical solution. The only other solution would be for the owner to extend William Street in their other lands that they own, and potentially come to some type of intersection where William Street would meet Victoria Avenue that would make it logically appear that William Street is continuous, such as a roundabout where William Street would meet Victoria. That being said, we have no roundabouts in Lindsay, and I don't think that is being contemplated due to other engineering issues about an extension of William Street North in the land that have been identified. So long story short, there are resolutions possible, but we may hear from the folks on William Street North and Springdale Gardens who may not be pleased with the renaming, but in the end, it may be the best solution for them. And thankfully, they wouldn't have to change their numbers on their houses. So that's the clerk's office perspective.
Didn't mean to complicate an uncomplicated situation. However, if maybe Caitlin, you haven't had a chance to speak today. Would you wish to speak on behalf of Regis Homes? If well, first of all, if there was an expense, it would probably be either up to bring me on the option for the city to pick it up or for Regis Homes to pick it up, right? Would they be the two options? I don't know whether you can speak for Regis today or not, but probably weren't expecting that. Maybe you were expecting the question, but would you have a comment on what you heard?
Hi, thanks for the question. No, I wasn't expecting that question, but I think when the time comes, we'd work with staff to figure out what's required from us and how we can help finalize that renaming process.
Okay. That being said, thanks for the answer. So I guess we'll rely on staff to go forward with the next, staff can resolve it rather than don't need a resolution today, probably, Richard?
Yeah, we'll resolve this. I suspect if Regis Homes wants to start fairly soon with the project, we'll need to move on this renaming fairly soon, probably in the fall.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, there's a resolution in our package today. What's committee's wishes? Mike Barkwell?
I'd like to move the motion that the report plan 2023-036, Regis Homes Limited, application D05-2017-001, and D06-2017-002 2017-019 be received, that the draft plan of subdivision 16T-17501, application D05-2017-01, as shown in the Appendix B, and the conditions substantially in the form attached as Appendix C to Report Plan 2023-036 be referred to Council for approval and adoption, that the zoning bylaw amendment substantially in the form attached as Appendix D to Report Plan 2023-036 be referred to Council for approval and adoption, and that in accordance with Section 34-17 of the Planning Act, Council having considered the changes to the proposed zoning bylaw amendment, deems no further public notice to be necessary, and that the mayor and clerk be authorized to execute any documents required by the approval of these applications.
Thank you, Mike. A seconder? Councillor McDonald. Any further discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. Well, thank you very much. That comes to the conclusion of our meeting today. I guess we need a motion to adjourn. Oh, something further, Mayor Latham? Mayor Helmsley.
He's not going to be happy with you. There was nothing in there about removing the holding symbol. Is that part of the appendixes, or do we have to deal with that separately?
Through the chair, that is part of the zoning bylaw amendment, so that has been removed. So you're approving that substantially in resolution number 3, part of that.
We have a mover? Okay, we're all good. A mover for adjournment. Mayor Elmsley, second by Deputy Mayor, no, Charlie. I'm getting out of town. Anyways, all those in favor? Thanks you. Have a good rest of the day.